David Gilmour is unique. He is the stillness and the soul, the painful notes in Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and the plea in Comfortably Numb seem to go on forever, thanks to the man whose black strat made them sound like they would never stop. He was not only a musician, he created temples of sadness and beauty out of nothing, and pain became sound. Millions of people still pause and listen to the eerie music he left behind. For many years, he was more than just a vocalist. His solos pierced deeper than words could, and he was a silent storm. He was the embodiment of transcendence and human suffering, but it was penned with tears and blood. Having to leave Syd Barrett to go insane tormented the friend. The only thing the brother could do was watch Richard Wright pass away from a horrible illness. Additionally, the artist was harmed by the deception. It is extremely painful for him to be rejected by the band he helped rise from the ashes. Anyone may have died in those catastrophes. Nevertheless, he persisted, transforming each injury into eternal music. Millions are shocked by the unsaid darkness that looms over the planet at the age of 79, when everyone believed he had found peace after years of storms. Which ghost still haunts the peaceful genius of Pink Floyd? Before we begin, please give David Gilmour a like to show your respect. He created the most exquisite music the world has ever heard out of excruciating anguish. Every legend begins with both a victory and an unheapable wound. Silence was the beginning of David Gilmour's hurt. Every note he ever played was fashioned by a terrible silence. It saddens me to consider that one of the most exquisite sounds in rock originated not from joy, but rather from a household where reason prevailed over passion and dinners did not conclude with laughter. He was born on March 6, 1946, in Cambridge, England. His mother, Sylvia, was a teacher who went on to work as a film editor, while his father, Douglas, was a naturalist and a university lecturer. Externally, it appeared to be a luxury. This steady, middle-class Grantchester home has books on every shelf, and the conversations are always intelligent. But to the reserved child seated at that table, it represented something else entirely, a forgotten area. Gilmour would discuss it in those identical words years later. Instead of discussing anarchy or poverty, he would talk about apathy that was more painful than any physical harm, a quiet that caused invisible but long-lasting scars. However, despite having brothers, he never felt accepted. And in the quiet chambers where he was raised, nobody paid any attention. His mother gave him a guitar when he was just 10 years old. She was unaware that she was going to alter music's history. He had no teacher or one to assist him, so he went inside his room and lit it with a lamp. The room was filled with the sound of a radio and a child bent over strings. It wasn't practice to keep playing the same riff. In a house that never spoke to him, it was his only means of survival. While other children shouted on playgrounds, David bent strings till they sobbed, carving emotion into music. By the age of 13, shadows were worsening the state of his impressionable mind. He was already considering his own mortality, tormented by the idea that life may be so short. David frequently avoided playing and arguing with his friends and co-workers at Cambridge's Per School. He had little interest in friendships or grades. At the Cambridge College of Arts and Technology, he later met Roger Waters and Syd Barrett. Their names would eventually be connected in legend because they were both pupils there. However, the guitar, which had grown to be his haven, kept his world smaller and more isolated over those years. Those extended periods of solitude became seeds. One day, the music would silence entire arenas. As a child, there were no violent altercations or shattered glass. Rather, there was something far darker, a quiet so heartbreakingly terrible that it broke the spirit. But he grew stronger in that quiet. He discovered how to transform solitude into a cathedral of sound, how to bend a single note to convey more suffering than words, and how to find beauty in nothingness. The youngster that no one could really hear became a guy whose song could fill an entire stadium. The silence didn't break him. He produced some of the most ethereally lovely melodies the world has ever heard, breaking the silence. Every worthwhile journey begins with a struggle rather than a triumph, and hunger was the beginning of David Gilmour's adventure. While his former classmates, Roger Waters and Syd Barrett, were making waves in London's psychedelic underground at the start of the 1960s, David was struggling to make ends meet with little local bands like Joker's Wild. Although he lacks a stage of his own, he is a very talented guitarist with a distinctive sound. In pursuit of their ambition to create music across a continent, he and his buddies journeyed to France, but the path was unkind. There were no guitars left. A few amplifiers were removed. The funds vanished. Occasionally, in order to purchase sustenance, he was forced to pawn the instrument that held his soul. In Paris, David performed for pay at roadside pubs and on cobblestone streets where passers-by didn't pause to listen. He lived for food and shelter, not for attention. Pink Floyd was on the rise, and everyone knew it. For David, Europe was a lengthy journey filled with empty bellies and weary fingers, a lesson in the harshness of fate for those left behind. When he did, he returned to London empty-handed. There was a drive that persisted without any band or equipment. Then came the shock, which was more painful than hunger. He ran into Syd Barrett once more when he went to a recording studio where Pink Floyd was working. He had busked with Barrett at Cambridge, who was now the lead vocalist of one of the most well-known bands in Britain. Syd, however, had changed. He was unable to talk clearly. His eyes were blurry and he was constantly moving. The brilliant light that had initially looked unstoppable had been extinguished by years of excessive drug use and the onset of a major mental disorder. Later, doctors discovered that these were symptoms of schizophrenia. He was unsure about David's identity as he glanced at him. In front of his eyes, the friend who used to paint sound in hues that no one else could see was disappearing. His thoughts were drifting further away. In addition to being a friend, David saw his brilliance crumbled. It wasn't only depressing. It was horrible. He no longer looked up to the boy he had once admired. The band that Syd had put so much effort into was on the verge of disbanding. Things went awry once more in 1967. Gilmour was requested to join Pink Floyd in case of an emergency, not to cover for someone else. If Syd was unable to perform, a fifth musician was to take over. For a few odd performances, 5 guys were on stage. 4 of them performed music, while one of them simply sat there. David recalls seeing Syd with his guitar dangling loosely over his neck when he turned back. As though the spotlight had turned to stone, Syd's eyes were motionless and blank. It was just too much. Shortly thereafter, the ruthless decision was taken. On the way to a show, they ceased to pick up Syd. That evening, Pink Floyd's lead guitarist, David Gilmour, took over. In the eyes of his admirers, he had assumed the position of a hero. To David, he was the one who had just parted ways with his insane friend. That wound would never go away. Being a member of Pink Floyd, however, did not improve the situation. The band was lost without its leader and founder. Sometimes David was so frightened that he wasn't sure if the music still made sense, so he would play on stage with his back to the audience. Their 1968 debut album, Without Syd, A Saucer Full of Secrets, was more of a means of survival than a statement. If they didn't continue to move and play, the dream had to end. They incorporated music from films such as Obscured by Clouds, 1972, and More, 1969. It's not fun labor, but it's essential. They could experiment on someone else's project, and there was money for them to do so. During these practices, David's guitar skills improved. He worked on what would become his signature extended delay, severe bending, and interminable sustain. Then something extraordinary emerged from this shroud of uncertainty. The 23-minute epic that serves as the highlight of their 1971 album Metal Echoes filled a whole side of vinyl. 4 men breathing together, creating a new identity out of the chaos was the sound. The first ping from Gilmour's guitar was like a spotlight in the dark. In the end, the music became a vast, wordless ocean. For the first time since Syd, Pink Floyd took a beating. That beat was produced by David's guitar. The journey had been filled with sadness and hunger, with being abandoned and then thrust into the spotlight without your will. Without a job and no friends, he had wandered the streets of Europe. He had witnessed a friend lose his mind and then vanish. He was afraid to go into crowds without a strategy, a guide, or any certainty, and he felt embarrassed to be in his position. Nevertheless, David Gilmour survived it all. He transformed doubt into sound, shame into love, and hunger into power. His instrument gave him a voice that would one day fill arenas and withstand the darkest shadows throughout those difficult years. As the 1970s progressed, David Gilmour's guitar evolved from a simple instrument to the anthem of the time. After The Dark Side of the Moon was revealed, The World Will Never Be the Same. Breathe was filled with his booming voice. His solos made time seem to go on forever. His riff turned the clink of money into a melody, while Claire Torrey's wail was overtaken by his scat lines on The Great Gig in the Sky. It wasn't only a document. Tens of millions of copies were sold, and it was a massive smash that remained on the charts for 15 years. Pink Floyd was a global power and no longer merely a cult band. Gilmour, who could bend a single note till it appeared to go on forever, was in the center, bringing the throng to a respectful silence. Although they were successful, the ghosts persisted. Wish You Were Here was more of a melancholy service than a song. Each of the 4 melancholy notes that opened Shine On You Crazy Diamond seemed like a tear dropping for Syd Barrett, the friend who once led them all, but was now crippled by drug usage and disease that wasn't receiving the treatment he needed. Long before Barrett's physical death, he had already died in his thoughts. That's not what Gilmour accomplished when he sang Wish You Were Here. It was a musical expression of melancholy. The absence is noted in the documents. Looking back, he would add that he felt Syd was with him in every syllable of the song. Never talking, always youthful, always lost, never reaching. Supporters praised it as yet another outstanding piece. It got David thinking about how addiction takes more than life and how talent might be lost. Futures that could have occurred are taken away. The cracks were widened by animals. Gilmour's guitar cried out for humanity, while Waters' words were rife with rage. Next was the wall. Despite being a battlefield, it was heralded as a victory. The structure in which they developed comfortably numb became a battlefield. Waters intended for the song to sound depressing. The two of them performed one of the greatest solos ever recorded when Gilmour fired back. However, the cost was extremely exorbitant. Gilmour's silent brother-in-arms, Rick Wright, was excluded from the recording session and was only permitted to work as a road worker. Gilmour sensed that the link was waning, the stage was growing colder, and the band's spirit was departing from the falling bricks and flying pigs. He subsequently commented, "I felt the music losing its meaning." He felt humiliated, even when things were going exceptionally well. Except for the name, the final version was entirely Waters's. Gilmour's voice was muffled, his personality was gone, and he was reduced to what he vehemently described as a session player in my own band. The headlines agreed with Waters when he announced that Pink Floyd was no longer together and that he was attempting to have the moniker removed. Gilmour's 20 years of life seemed to vanish in an instant, as though the man who had borne their sound had never mattered. The loss at work wasn't the only one. It was erasing. Gilmour, however, refused to leave. When he ran out of things to say, he returned to the studio and let his guitar do the talking. Stadiums were crowded, despite the skepticism of critics, as a momentary lapse of reason rose against all odds. Getting back on track as a couple and making peace were discussed 7 years later in the Division Bell. It made a lot of money on the trip. Their power lasted indefinitely thanks to Pulse. The burden of being the sub was finally lifted. There was more than one man in Pink Floyd. Gilmour was also present. But death could not be stopped by victory. Gilmour, Waters, Wright, and Mason stood side by side for the final time at Live 8. For them, it was more than just a song. It was the return of heaven. Suddenly, 4 men who had been split apart by silence and rage were breathing together once more. The years appeared to vanish for a brief instant, as if time had forgotten about them. The noise of the crowd was like thunder. However, Gilmour had a shade behind his eyes, as though he realized the wonder would soon come to an end. 3 years later, that worry materialized. At age 65, Rick Wright passed away from cancer. In harmony and with a soothing voice, he was his brother. Gilmour believed it to be the most ruthless rhyme or logic. Syd lost it and went insane. Rick passed away. And now all that remained of the band they had formed was a collection of photos, recordings, and specters. The death wasn't merely that of a friend. It was the final breath of Pink Floyd. In order to create The Endless River, Wright pieced together his playing. The experience felt more like a seance than a CD. A voice from the other side, a man who was no longer able to sit next to him on stage, could be heard with every note. Everyone found it to be music. Gilmour interpreted it as a farewell, a burial, and the final exhale of an unrevivable friendship. Afterward, Gilmour examined himself. His one piece was now about honesty rather than theatrics. In 2006, he penned the lyrics to the song On an Island, demonstrating his acceptance of both beauty and suffering. Rattle That Lock, released in 2015, was about having the voice of someone who had experienced every storm, liberation, and discovery. When he returned to Pompeii, where he had stood with Floyd as a young guy, it was only him and his guitar. It was a lovely way to close the circle. David Gilmour's work has a happy and sad backstory. Stadiums erupted in roar at his music, but silence accompanied him home. Despite the pain of betrayal, he persisted. He could still hear his pals via his strings despite the fact that he had lost them. He transformed loss into timeless music, hunger into strength, and guilt into kindness. Once borrowing money to purchase meals, the boy became a man who wrote timeless songs. Even today, when the walls fall and the lights go out, David Gilmour's guitar continues to pierce the darkness. It serves as a voice for everyone who has experienced love, loss, or hardship. Being in a stadium gave him the impression that he was unbeatable. However, David Gilmour found himself in a void that was too big for the stage to support after the audience dispersed and the lights went out. There were serious cracks in Pink Floyd. But what happened next was even more painful. His own home's collapse. His marriage, which ought to have been secure, began to unravel at this precise moment. The band was disintegrating, despite his best efforts to keep it together. When David married Virginia Ginger Hazenbein in 1975, Floyd was a huge success. Ginger was a stunning American artist and model. Their formative years were brimming with promise and optimism. They can be seen laughing together in photos. A young couple stood on the precipice of an endless future, full of song and optimism. Love was not always present in Gilmour's upbringing. He believed that getting married would allow him to provide his children with the presents he had missed as a youngster and warm up his house. Following Alice, 1976, Claire, 1979, Sarah, 1981, and Matthew, 1986, the house was a flurry of activity, with shouts echoing down the hallways and small feet scurrying to greet him upon his return from tours. In order to convince himself that there was something more significant than an encore waiting for him at home, he used to reflect about those years. However, as the 1980s wore on, the strain of leading a constantly stressful life began to permeate every aspect of his life. The band was in disarray. People wanted to know what he did. He was viewed by the outside world as a substitute rather than the song's focal point. The time spent away grew longer at home. Weeks became months, and nights became weeks. Ginger used to look stunning when she was with him, but she grew weary of being surrounded by a man who was as much a part of many other people's lives as she was. When they were younger, the children frequently questioned why their father was absent so frequently. More painful than any review were the questions. David would later remark that he was seeing the dissolution of his marriage at the same time that the band was disbanding, with the subdued melancholy of someone who doesn't like to express their pain. David's 1990 divorce wasn't startling or well publicized, but it seemed disastrous to him. I think I didn't understand how bad things were getting until it was too late. It was he who could play a single note and fill a stadium. However, he was unable to maintain his own family. Friends recall how empty he appeared when he entered the studio during those years, carrying his guitar as though it were a burden rather than a present. Ginger spent much of the time with the children. The most difficult thing for David, despite his continued presence in their lives, was being alone and separated from the craziness of fatherhood. Just being there, reading stories before bed, and listening to everyone laugh during dinner. David rarely discussed the loss, except in passing. But Ginger would often remark gently, "We were young, we loved each other, but the world around us was too loud, too consuming. In the end, it drowned us. The 4 children they had together still made him proud. But even after the papers were signed, he continued to feel the agony of that failed marriage." This man's music, like all of his, was inspired by suffering. This scar came from the collapse of the one place he had thought to find peace, not from a reviewer or a bandmate. There are moments when light shines through the darkness of life. That illumination for David Gilmour arrived in the early 1990s when he met Polly Sampson, a reporter and writer whose work was characterized by fire and kindness. He had previously experienced a failed marriage due to distance and stillness, but Polly was a spark and an anchor. She was Gilmour's partner in addition to his friend. They appeared to realize that Gilmour's music was more of a means of survival than a career, and they both had an interest in art. Although they were dealing with personal and professional issues at the time, they were married in 1994, and he would later say of Polly, "I found not only love but honesty. She gave me words when I didn't have any." As Pink Floyd prepared to release The Division Bell, the rest of the world believed they were still titans. But the music was a reflection of something more intimate. The record and their relationship are built through Polly's words flowing into Gilmour's tunes and their collaborative interaction. Her words were heard in songs like High Hopes. To David, they were something different. But to others, they were echoes of grandeur and sadness. In between Pink Floyd's songs comes a coded message from his wife. The music was both an embrace and a confession, and it was one of the few occasions when the private and the public were in harmony. Before long, their home was filled with contented children. In addition to David's 4 children from his first marriage, they produced 4 children together. Their family now numbered 8. The house had been silent after the breakup, but now it was alive with the sounds of footsteps, disputes, laughter, and the steady rhythm of everyday life. There used to be a chilly quiet when that man got home. For him, this was akin to reviving. Friends who visited David during those years recall him not as the spectral figure bent over a guitar, but rather as a husband playing quietly as Polly scrawled notes close by, or as a father sitting on the floor with toys all about him. Yes, it was home life, but it was also alchemy, transforming suffering into cooperation. She has also been open about their relationship. I never felt like I was stepping into a legend's shadow. I felt like I was stepping into a life, and it was a life we were building together. For David, there were still some ghosts in that life, such as the grief over his ex-wife's passing and the absence of his children, who spent the majority of their time with Ginger. Polly, however, allowed him to view those spirits without allowing them to take control. She served both a safe haven and a mirror for him. Even great artists, she assured him, were men in need of forgiveness, love, and a home. Their artistic collaboration became more solid as the years passed. Gilmour's solo albums, including On an Island, 2006, which peaked at number 1 in the UK charts, featured songs written by Polly. The lyrics were intimate rather than ostentatious or grandiose. Peace, contemplation, and the silent triumph of surviving life were the themes of the songs, words that allowed his music and her voice to shine. Rattle That Lock, 2015, later depicted Gilmour as a more liberated individual who was still searching but unbroken. His music gave him the impression that he was constantly at his side, a friend who had supported him through all of life's challenges.